I used to I used to believe that when someone dies, their memory lives on through the things they loved. But I've learned that some people see a person's treasures as nothing more than clutter to be erased. That bitter truth hit me like a sledgehammer the day I discovered my daughter-in-law had thrown away my late husband's entire workshop without asking, tossing decades of his craftsmanship into a dumpster like garbage. What she didn't know was that I owned the house she was living in, and sometimes the best way to teach respect for the dead is to remind the living just how fragile their comfort really is. My name is Vivian Caldwell, and at 71, I've seen enough of life to know when someone mistakes kindness for weakness. I'm a retired librarian who spent 43 years organizing other people's stories, but I never imagined I'd become the protagonist of such a dramatic one myself. After my husband Clarence passed from cancer 2 years ago, I thought moving in with my son Marcus and his wife Celeste would bring comfort to all of us. A chance to share memories, help with their twin boys, and keep Clarence's spirit alive in the home we'd bought together 30 years prior. The house sits on 3 acres in Millbrook Heights, a quiet suburb where Clarence had built his dream workshop in the converted barn behind our main residence. That workshop wasn't just a building, it was his sanctuary, filled with hand-carved furniture he'd crafted over decades, vintage tools passed down from his grandfather, and half-finished projects that still smelled like cedar and dreams. Every chisel, every plane, every lovingly restored antique saw told the story of a man who believed in creating beauty with his hands. I'd always been proud of how generous I was with Marcus and Celeste, never charging them rent despite being the sole owner of the property, helping with groceries, babysitting 7-year-old Jasper and Jackson, and maintaining the peaceful harmony I thought we all cherished. Celeste seemed sweet enough, always polite, always smiling, but there was something in her eyes when she looked at Clarence's workshop, something I should have recognized sooner. It was the look of someone who saw obstacles where others saw memories, inconvenience where others saw legacy. I should have trusted my instincts because respect for the dead isn't something you can teach. It's something you either have or you don't. Last Tuesday started like any other. I'd taken the twins, Jasper and Jackson, to their swimming lessons at the community center, something I did every week to help Marcus and Celeste with their busy schedules. The boys chattered excitedly about their backstroke progress as we drove home, and I felt that familiar warmth of being useful, of being needed. I'd stopped at the farmer's market afterward to pick up fresh tomatoes for dinner, planning to make Clarence's favorite pasta sauce, a small way of keeping his memory alive at our dinner table. But as we pulled into the long gravel driveway, something felt wrong. The barn doors, which I always kept respectfully closed, were thrown wide open. A massive yellow dumpster sat beside the building like a metal vulture, and I could hear voices echoing from inside. My heart began to race as I helped the twins out of the car, telling them to go inside for their snacks while I investigated the commotion. What I saw when I reached the barn entrance will haunt me until my dying day. Celeste stood in the center of what used to be Clarence's sacred workspace, directing 2 young men in coveralls as they hauled decades of his craftsmanship toward the dumpster. His hand-carved jewelry box, the first piece he'd ever made for me, was already buried under a pile of what she clearly considered junk. His grandfather's antique woodworking planes, tools that had shaped 3 generations of beautiful furniture, were being tossed like scrap metal. "What are you doing?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my heart breaking. Celeste turned with that practiced smile, not a trace of guilt in her expression. "Oh, Vivian! Perfect timing. I've been meaning to talk to you about this space." She gestured around the nearly empty barn as if she were unveiling a renovation project. "Marcus and I have decided to convert this into a home gym and yoga studio. All this old stuff was just collecting dust, so I hired these guys to clear it out. Much more practical this way, don't you think?" I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. 43 years of marriage, 2 years of widowhood, and countless hours I'd spent in this barn just sitting among Clarence's tools and remembering his gentle hands shaping wood, all of it reduced to old stuff that needed clearing. The half-finished rocking chair he'd been making for our future grandchildren was already gone, probably crushed under the weight of everything else this heartless woman had deemed worthless. Practical, I repeated, the word tasting like poison in my mouth. The world tilted sideways as I watched the men carry out Clarence's antique workbench, the same bench where he'd taught Marcus to whittle as a boy, where he'd carved our initials surrounded by a heart on our 20th anniversary. Each item they removed felt like another shovel of dirt being thrown on his grave, erasing him piece by piece until it would be as if he'd never existed at all. My legs felt unsteady, and I had to grip the door frame to keep from collapsing. The physical pain in my chest was so intense I wondered if I was having a heart attack. 2 years of grief had taught me that missing someone could hurt, but this was different. This was the deliberate destruction of everything I had left of the man I'd loved for over 4 decades. The rocking chair, I managed to whisper, scanning the barn desperately. Where's the rocking chair he was making? Celeste followed my gaze with casual indifference. Oh, that unfinished thing? It went in the first load. Honestly, Vivian, I don't understand why you're getting so emotional. It's just old wood and rusty tools. We can buy new exercise equipment that actually serves a purpose. Just old wood, rusty tools. The words echoed in my skull like a death knell. This woman had lived in Clarence's house for 3 years, had eaten dinners he'd prepared at tables he'd built, had benefited from his generosity and wisdom, and she saw his life's work as nothing more than debris to be hauled away. I thought about the nights I'd spent in that barn after his funeral, running my fingers over the tools he'd touched thousands of times, breathing in the lingering scent of sawdust and the wood stain he'd preferred. Those moments had been my communion with his memory, my way of feeling close to him when the emptiness of our bedroom became unbearable. Now even that comfort was gone, dumped in a landfill somewhere because my daughter-in-law needed space for her yoga mats. But I didn't scream, I didn't cry. Something cold and calculating settled over me like a winter frost, preserving me until I could decide exactly how to respond. 43 years of marriage had taught me patience, and 43 years as a librarian had taught me that knowledge was power. I had information Celeste didn't know I possessed, and information I was beginning to realize could be a devastating weapon when wielded correctly. I see, I said quietly, my voice steady as stone. I understand completely. Looking back, I should have seen this coming. The signs were there from the very beginning, hidden beneath Celeste's carefully constructed facade of sweetness and respect. When Marcus first brought her home 5 years ago, I'd been charmed by her southern accent and the way she called me Miss Vivian with such apparent affection. She was beautiful in that polished way some women perfect. Always perfectly styled hair, always the right outfit, always knowing exactly what to say to make people feel special. But even then, I'd noticed how her eyes would dart around our home during dinners, cataloging everything like she was taking inventory. She'd compliment Clarence's handmade dining table while running her finger along its edge in a way that seemed more appraising than appreciative. When he'd proudly show her his latest project, she'd smile and nod, but I caught her glancing at her phone or checking her reflection in the china cabinet glass. After they married and moved in with us 3 years ago, the comments started small. "This house has such potential," she'd say. Or, with a little updating, "This place could be magazine-worthy." She'd suggest we donate Clarence's books to make room for a wine fridge, or hint that the workshop space could be better utilized for entertaining. I'd brushed off these remarks as enthusiasm, thinking she just wanted to contribute to our home's improvement. Clarence, bless his generous heart, had welcomed her completely. He'd built custom shelving for her extensive shoe collection, crafted a beautiful vanity for their bedroom, and even started on a hope chest for the grandchildren we all hoped would come someday. He'd spend hours in the barn working on surprise gifts for her, a jewelry box for her birthday, a spice rack for the kitchen, little tokens of acceptance and love. She'd accept these gifts with appropriate gratitude, but I noticed they'd disappear after a while, replaced by store-bought versions she'd purchased herself. When I'd ask about the beautiful cutting board Clarence had made from cherry wood, she'd wave her hand dismissively and say something about preferring bamboo for hygiene reasons. The jewelry box vanished when she upgraded to a modern acrylic organizer that maximized space better. Even Marcus seemed to drift away from his father's memory after Clarence passed. Where he'd once spent Sunday afternoons in the workshop learning woodworking techniques, he now spent them at Celeste's family gatherings, or shopping for things we didn't need. The bond between father and son, built on shared projects and quiet conversations over sandpaper and stain, faded as quickly as sawdust in the wind. I'd convinced myself that time would help them appreciate what Clarence had left behind, that eventually they'd understand the value of his craftsmanship and the love embedded in every piece. Instead, I'd watched them systematically erase him from the home he'd built with his own hands. The erasure of Clarence's presence had been so gradual that I'd almost missed it happening. It started about 6 months after the funeral, when Celeste began rearranging furniture to improve the flow. The oak coffee table Clarence had spent 3 months perfecting was moved to the basement because it was too bulky for the space. His hand-carved mantelpiece decorations disappeared during spring cleaning, replaced by generic ceramic pieces from the home goods store. Each change came with a reasonable explanation. The antique tools hanging in the kitchen were rusty and unsanitary. Never mind that they were family heirlooms from Clarence's grandfather. The beautiful wooden bowls he'd turned on his lathe were difficult to maintain compared to the plastic ones she preferred. Even the wooden spoons he'd carved for specific recipes vanished, replaced by a sterile set from Williams-Sonoma. I'd started keeping a mental inventory of what was disappearing, but I'd told myself I was being overly sentimental. Celeste was young, after all, and had different tastes. Surely she didn't mean any disrespect. When I'd gently ask about missing items, she'd look genuinely confused and suggest they might be in storage somewhere. Or perhaps we'd donated them and forgotten. But the comments grew bolder over time. She'd stand in the barn doorway during family barbecues, shaking her head at what she called Clarence's hoarding problem. She'd joke with friends about living in a museum and how she was slowly bringing the house into the 21st century. When the twins would ask about Grandpa's tools, she'd redirect their attention to video games or tablets, dismissing their curiosity about woodworking as messy and dangerous. The breaking point should have been last Christmas, when she suggested we clear out all the old-fashioned stuff to make room for a more modern holiday aesthetic. She'd hired decorators without asking me, and they'd wanted to remove Clarence's handmade ornament display case, a gorgeous walnut cabinet with glass doors that had housed 4 decades of holiday memories. I'd finally put my foot down then, insisting the case stay put. But I'd seen the flash of irritation in her eyes when I'd refused to budge. That's when I realized this wasn't about different tastes or generational preferences. This was about control, about erasing any trace of the life Clarence and I had built together. She wanted a blank slate, a house that reflected only her vision and her values, and my late husband's legacy was simply an obstacle to be eliminated. I'd been too grief-stricken to fight these small battles, too grateful for their company to risk conflict over what seemed like minor issues. But standing in that empty barn, surrounded by the echoes of everything I'd failed to protect, I finally understood that my silence hadn't kept the peace. It had enabled my own heartbreak. That night, I sat in my bedroom, the same room Clarence and I had shared for 30 years, staring at the empty space where his dresser used to stand. Celeste had helped me pack his clothes for donation months ago, and now I wondered how many other pieces of him had disappeared under the guise of helping me heal. The room felt hollow, stripped of his presence just like his workshop, and I realized I'd been complicit in my own emotional devastation. I pulled out my laptop, something I rarely used since retiring, and began searching through digital photos from happier times. There was Clarence in his workshop, grinning as he showed off a completed bookshelf. There were the twins, barely old enough to walk, toddling around between his workbenches while he kept careful watch. There was Marcus, teenager again in the photos, holding up a birdhouse he'd built under his father's patient guidance. All of it was gone now, not lost to time or natural deterioration, but deliberately destroyed by someone who'd looked at 40 years of love and craftsmanship and seen nothing but inconvenience. My grief transformed into something sharper, something with teeth and claws and an unshakable sense of purpose. I opened a new browser tab and searched for property lawyers in our area. If Celeste could make unilateral decisions about our home, then I could too. The difference was that my name was on the deed, and hers wasn't. Clarence and I had purchased this house together decades ago, but after his death, ownership had transferred entirely to me. In all the months since then, it had never occurred to me to use that fact as leverage, until now. The first attorney I called was unavailable, but the second, a woman named Patricia Henley, agreed to see me the following afternoon. I made the appointment with steady hands and a clear voice, feeling more decisive than I had in 2 years. When Marcus knocked on my door to check on me, asking if I was feeling all right after what had happened in the barn, I smiled and told him I was fine, that I understood Celeste's perspective and wasn't upset about the workshop. I'd learned something valuable in my 43 years as a librarian. The most powerful weapon against someone who underestimated you was letting them continue to believe they held all the cards. Celeste thought she'd won, thought she'd successfully erased the last traces of Clarence's presence without consequence. She had no idea that her victory celebration was premature. Sleep came easier that night than it had in months. I dreamed of Clarence, standing in his workshop surrounded by all his beautiful creations, smiling at me with that proud look he'd get when I'd finally stand up for myself. In the dream, he winked and said, "Show them what happens when they mess with a librarian, Vivi." I woke up knowing exactly what I was going to do. Patricia Henley turned out to be exactly the kind of attorney I needed: sharp, experienced, and utterly unsympathetic to people who took advantage of grieving widows. Her office was lined with law books and family photos, and she listened to my story with the kind of focused attention that told me she'd heard similar tales before. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said after I'd finished explaining the situation, "you have absolute authority here. The property is yours entirely, and while family relationships complicate things emotionally, legally speaking, you have every right to make decisions about your own home." She walked me through my options, each one more satisfying than the last. I could sell the house immediately with proper notice. I could evict them as non-paying tenants. I could change the locks and force them to find alternative housing. The choice was entirely mine, and the law was entirely on my side. But I had something more elegant in mind than simple eviction. I wanted them to understand exactly what they'd taken from me, and I wanted that understanding to cost them everything they'd taken for granted. Over the next week, I began gathering documentation with the same methodical precision I'd once used to catalog library collections. I photographed every room in the house, noting which items were Clarence's craftsmanship and which were store-bought replacements. I compiled receipts showing how much I'd contributed to household expenses over the past 3 years: utilities, groceries, property taxes, insurance. The total was staggering. I'd essentially subsidized their entire lifestyle while they lived rent-free in my home. I also began making discreet inquiries about the contents of that dumpster. The waste management company was surprisingly helpful when I explained that family heirlooms had been accidentally discarded. Unfortunately, that particular load had already been processed, meaning Clarence's tools and projects were gone forever. But this information would serve a purpose in what I was planning. Most importantly, I researched the current market value of our property. 3 acres in Millbrook Heights, with a 4-bedroom house and outbuildings, was worth significantly more than when Clarence and I had bought it. The real estate market was hot, and properties like ours were selling within days of listing. I spent hours that week sitting in what remained of Clarence's workshop, planning my strategy with the same careful attention to detail he'd once applied to his woodworking projects. Every cut had to be precise, every joint had to be perfect, and every step had to serve the ultimate design. Celeste had taught me that sentiment was weakness, that memories were clutter to be discarded. Fine. I'd show her exactly how practical I could be when I applied that philosophy to our living situation. The final piece of my preparation was the most painful. I sorted through what few items of Clarence's had survived Celeste's purge, packing them carefully in storage boxes that I moved to a secure facility across town. His wedding ring, photo albums, a few books with his handwritten notes in the margins. Everything that was truly irreplaceable and truly mine. I was ready to begin. My newfound calm apparently made Celeste suspicious. For the past week, she'd been watching me carefully, clearly expecting tears or angry confrontations about the workshop. When neither materialized, she seemed to interpret my composure as acceptance, and her behavior became even more brazen. She started talking openly about her plans for our property, discussing with friends how she wanted to install a swimming pool where Clarence's garden used to be, and how the main house needed major updating to reflect modern tastes. She'd taken to hosting neighbors for coffee in what she now called her kitchen, showing off the space like she was auditioning for a home and garden magazine. The most telling moment came when I overheard her phone conversation with her sister. "I know it sounds harsh," she was saying, "but Vivian's been stuck in the past for too long. That workshop was like a shrine, and it wasn't healthy for any of us. Sometimes you have to be the bad guy to help people move forward." She actually believed she'd done me a favor. In her mind, destroying my husband's legacy was an act of kindness, tough love designed to force me through the grieving process more quickly. The arrogance was breathtaking, but it also confirmed that she had no idea what was coming. Her confidence reached new heights when she started dropping hints about wanting to make some bigger changes to the property. She mentioned hiring a landscaper to modernize Clarence's carefully tended flower beds, and she'd been researching contractors to knock out the wall between the kitchen and dining room. Every conversation felt like a preview of coming attractions, a glimpse into how thoroughly she planned to erase every trace of the life Clarence and I had built. Marcus, meanwhile, remained obliviously supportive of his wife's renovation dreams. He'd nod along when she talked about improvements, occasionally adding his own suggestions about turning the basement into a man cave or expanding the master bathroom. Never once did he mention his father's contributions to the house or express any regret about the workshop's destruction. Watching them plan their future in my home, using my resources, while dismissing my husband's memory as an inconvenience, it crystallized everything I needed to know about their character. They saw me as a placeholder, a temporary obstacle between them, and full ownership of what they already considered theirs. They were counting on my grief and my age to keep me passive and grateful for their company. They had no idea that 71 years of life had taught me to be anything but passive when something truly mattered. And they were about to learn that gratitude, like respect, had to be earned, not demanded, and certainly not taken for granted while trampling on everything I held sacred. On Monday morning, I made 3 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to Patricia, confirming that all the paperwork was ready. The second was to Sotheby's International Realty, the most prestigious firm in our area. The third was to a moving company that specialized in rapid relocations. By Tuesday afternoon, a sleek black sedan pulled into our driveway, followed by a professional photographer's van. The real estate agent, a polished woman named Rebecca Sterling, introduced herself to me on the front porch, while Celeste watched from the kitchen window with growing alarm. "Mrs. Caldwell," Rebecca said, shaking my hand with a firm grip. "I've reviewed the property details, and I'm confident we can have this listed by Thursday. The market is extremely favorable for homes like yours." Celeste appeared in the doorway so quickly she must have sprinted from the kitchen. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake," she said, that familiar sweet tone not quite hiding the panic underneath. "We're not selling this house." Rebecca consulted her tablet with professional efficiency. "According to my paperwork, Mrs. Vivian Caldwell is the sole owner of this property. Are you Mrs. Caldwell?" The color drained from Celeste's face as she realized what was happening. "Vivian, what is this? What are you doing?" I smiled at her with the same calm expression she'd worn while directing the destruction of Clarence's workshop. "I'm being practical, dear, just like you taught me. This house is too big for one person, and all this old stuff is just taking up space. Much more sensible to sell and let someone else deal with the maintenance." "But we live here. Our children live here. You can't just—" "Actually, I can," I interrupted gently. Patricia explained my rights very thoroughly. As the sole owner, I can sell my property whenever I choose. I've decided to choose now. Marcus's truck pulled into the driveway at that moment, and I watched him take in the scene. The real estate agent, the photographer setting up equipment, his wife's stricken expression, and my serene smile. He jogged toward us with the same confused panic I'd seen on his face as a child when he'd broken something valuable and couldn't figure out how to fix it. "Mom, what's going on? Celeste called me at work, said something about selling the house?" Rebecca answered before I could. "We're preparing a luxury listing for this beautiful property. Mrs. Caldwell wants to move quickly, so we're aiming for a Thursday market debut. I expect we'll have multiple offers by the weekend." The photographer had already begun documenting the exterior, and I could see him making notes about the barn, the empty barn that Celeste had so efficiently cleared for me. How convenient that she'd already removed all that clutter. The space would photograph beautifully now, ready for the new owners to envision their own possibilities. "You can't do this," Marcus said, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "This is our home. Where will we go? What about the twins?" I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved and supported through every stage of his life, and felt something shift permanently in my chest. "You'll figure it out," I said quietly. "You're both very practical people." The next 48 hours brought a parade of increasingly desperate attempts to change my mind. First came Marcus alone, appearing at my bedroom door at 7 a.m. with red-rimmed eyes and coffee-stained clothes, looking like he hadn't slept since our conversation with the real estate agent. "Mom, please," he begged, sitting heavily on the edge of my bed. "I know Celeste made a mistake with Dad's workshop, but we can fix this. We can rebuild everything exactly the way it was. I still remember how he made that rocking chair. I can finish it myself." I studied my son's face, seeing Clarence's features mixed with my own, and felt a deep sadness that had nothing to do with grief. "Marcus, do you even remember what was in that workshop? Can you tell me 3 specific things your father was working on when he died?" The silence stretched between us like a canyon. He couldn't answer because he hadn't been paying attention, hadn't valued those details enough to preserve them in his memory. The workshop hadn't mattered to him any more than it had mattered to Celeste. It was just another obstacle to their vision of modern convenience. "It's too late for rebuilding," I told him gently. "Some things, once destroyed, can't be restored." Next came Celeste, armed with tears and a carefully prepared speech about family and forgiveness. She'd dressed carefully for this performance, a soft blue sweater that matched her eyes, minimal makeup to highlight her natural beauty, and the small cross necklace she only wore when she wanted to emphasize her Christian values. "Miss Vivian," she said, settling into the chair beside my bed with practiced grace, "I've been praying about this situation, and I realize I acted hastily with Clarence's things. I was only thinking about creating a healthier environment for the children, but I see now that I should have consulted you first." The word "consulted" hung in the air like smoke. Not asked permission, not respected your wishes, but consulted, as if my opinion about my dead husband's possessions was merely one perspective to be considered among many. "I appreciate your honesty," I replied calmly, "and I appreciate you teaching me such a valuable lesson about being practical instead of sentimental. I'm applying that lesson now." Her composure cracked slightly. "But selling the house? That's so extreme. The children will be traumatized, uprooted from the only home they've ever known. Surely you don't want to hurt innocent babies because of an adult disagreement." "The twins are 7 years old," I pointed out, "and they'll adjust beautifully to whatever new situation you and Marcus create for them. Children are remarkably resilient when they have loving, capable parents to guide them." The final assault came that evening, both of them together, flanked by the twins who had clearly been coached to look as pitiful as possible. Jasper and Jackson stood in my doorway in their pajamas, clutching stuffed animals and staring at me with wide, confused eyes. "Grandma Vivi," Jasper whispered, "Mommy says we have to move away. Don't you want us to live with you anymore?" It was expertly orchestrated emotional manipulation. and it might have worked on the old version of myself, the grandmother who put family harmony above everything else, who swallowed hurt feelings to avoid conflict. But I'd learned something valuable in the past few days. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's destructive behavior, even when that refusal causes temporary pain. I knelt down to the boys' level and spoke directly to them, ignoring their parents' expectant faces. "I love you both very much," I said, "and that will never change, no matter where any of us live." Sometimes grown-ups make decisions that seem confusing, but those decisions aren't about love. They're about what's right and fair. I looked up at Marcus and Celeste, meeting their eyes steadily. "You have 5 days to find alternative housing. The moving truck arrives Monday morning to collect my belongings, and the new owners take possession Tuesday. I suggest you use your time wisely." The house sold in 36 hours, exactly as Rebecca had predicted. A young couple from California made an all-cash offer $15,000 above asking price, thrilled to find a property with so much potential for customization. They loved the empty barn and were already making plans to convert it into an art studio. They thought the house had good bones, but were excited to put their own stamp on everything. I accepted their offer immediately. The next few days provided a fascinating glimpse into Marcus and Celeste's problem-solving skills when their usual safety net was unavailable. Without my financial support and free housing, they discovered that their lifestyle had been far more expensive than they'd realized. The mortgage pre-approval process revealed that their debt-to-income ratio was higher than most lenders preferred, especially when they couldn't count on help from family members. Celeste's job at the boutique marketing firm provided decent income, but not enough to cover the mortgage on anything comparable to what they were losing. Marcus's salary as a mid-level manager was respectable but hardly sufficient for the 3-acre properties and custom homes they'd grown accustomed to. Together, they could afford a modest suburban house with a small yard and standard fixtures, a significant downgrade from the life I'd been subsidizing. The panic was evident in their increasingly frantic phone calls to relatives, friends, and anyone who might offer temporary housing or financial assistance. I overheard Celeste explaining to her mother that they were being forced out by an unreasonable woman who was clearly not thinking straight in her grief. She painted herself as the victim of my emotional instability, conveniently omitting her role in destroying my husband's legacy. But the truth has a way of surfacing, especially in small communities where people pay attention to details. Neighbors had witnessed the dumpster scene, had heard Celeste's casual dismissal of old junk, and had seen my quiet dignity in the aftermath. When word spread about the house sale, the general consensus was that actions have consequences, and some lessons are more expensive than others. The moving truck arrived Monday morning as scheduled, and I supervised the careful packing of everything that truly mattered to me: photo albums, a few pieces of furniture with sentimental value, and the small collection of Clarence's belongings that had survived Celeste's purge. The rest could stay with the house. Let the new owners decide what had value and what was simply clutter taking up space. I watched from my car as Marcus and Celeste loaded their own belongings into a rented truck, their faces grim with the reality of their reduced circumstances. The twins seemed confused but adaptable, turning the moving process into an adventure game. Children, I reflected, often handled life's changes better than the adults who created them. As they drove away from the house where 3 generations of my family had lived, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: complete peace. Not happiness exactly, but the deep satisfaction that comes from finally standing up for something that mattered, even when that stand came at a significant personal cost. 6 months later, I'm living in a charming 2-bedroom cottage near the coast, close enough to smell salt air when the wind is right. The house came fully furnished, so I didn't need much beyond my personal belongings and memories. There's a small workshop space in the garage where I've started learning woodworking myself, not to replace what Clarence created, but to understand the joy he found in shaping raw materials into something beautiful and functional. My neighbor, Eleanor, is a retired teacher who shares my love of quiet mornings and afternoon tea. We take walks along the shore most evenings, talking about books and grandchildren and the surprising freedom that comes with simplifying your life. She never knew Clarence, but she listens when I tell stories about his craftsmanship. And she understands why preserving his memory mattered more than preserving family harmony. The twins visit once a month, usually on Saturdays when Marcus drives the hour and a half from their new suburban neighborhood. They seem happy enough in their smaller house, and they've made friends with the kids next door. Jasper has started asking questions about woodworking, inspired by an old photo of his grandfather that I keep on my mantelpiece. I've promised to teach him some basic techniques when he's older, passing down what knowledge I can preserve. Marcus and I have found a new equilibrium in our relationship, more respectful, less presumptuous, built on the understanding that love doesn't automatically grant unlimited access to someone else's resources or patience. Our conversations are careful but genuine, and I think he's finally beginning to understand that protecting my boundaries wasn't an act of cruelty, but an act of self-preservation that ultimately benefited everyone involved. Celeste and I maintain a polite distance. She sends birthday cards and Christmas gifts, signs her name to family photos, and includes me in group texts about the children's activities. The forced warmth of our early relationship has been replaced by civil acknowledgement, which is honest in a way that our previous dynamic never was. I suspect she's learned to be more careful about whose belongings she discards without permission. I've established a small scholarship fund in Clarence's name, supporting young people who want to learn traditional crafts and woodworking skills. It's funded by the profit from the house sale, and it ensures that his love of creating beautiful things with careful hands will outlive both of us. Sometimes the best way to honor someone's memory isn't to preserve their physical possessions, but to invest in the values they represented. The most important lesson I've learned is that true family isn't about who shares your blood or your living space. It's about who shares your values and respects what matters to you. Love that requires you to sacrifice your dignity, your boundaries, or your most sacred memories isn't love at all. It's dependency disguised as devotion, and it helps no one in the long run. At 71, I've finally learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. I'm alone by choice now, surrounded by people who value my company without expecting me to purchase their affection through constant sacrifice. I sleep peacefully in my own space, make decisions based on my own priorities, and wake up each morning knowing that everything around me reflects who I am rather than who someone else wants me to be. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is teach them that respect is not optional, that generosity is not infinite, and that taking someone for granted will eventually cost them everything they thought was guaranteed. It's a hard lesson, but it's one that serves everyone better in the end. Clarence would be proud, I think, of the woman I've become in his absence. Strong enough to honor his memory, wise enough to protect my own peace, and brave enough to choose dignity over false harmony. That's a legacy